Hello, welcome back to our lecture series on Western Civilization 101. Now, after our first lecture, we hopefully realized that learning history can be fun. Definitely Mr. Elliott knows how to make that happen. Not just a lot of boring facts in a textbook. Very, very fascinating. I look forward to hearing Mr. Elliott's second lecture titled From Alley-Oop, I have to find out who that is, to John Deere, discussing the Neolithic Age or the New Stone Age. The years between 10,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE. It's around 3000 BCE that we see the Sumerians, a group that lived in the ancient Near East or ancient Mesopotamia with the invention of writing. So that's the transition into the historical time frame, as opposed to what we're talking about today would be the prehistoric. We're still in the prehistoric age. I really love Mr. Elliott's comparison of the definition of civilization with how the prehistoric people lived. It's very interesting. Mr. Elliott calls it a shopping list, and you will find out a little bit more about this during his lecture. Just a few things, however. One of the definitions of civilization involved agriculture and herding. Having food and also having food that you can store away and eat later that would help to feed large populations. Now, we know that there was no farming, there was no agriculture in the prehistoric times. The women would gather the food, the men would hunt, wander, nomadic, hunting the game. And there wasn't a surplus. When they had to continually look for food in order to survive and in order to eat. So we're seeing a difference there. One more point with this, and then you'll learn more as Mr. Elliott talks about it, but with the cities. We know that having the cities being built and population centers, that this was a definition of civilization. Well, what about these hunting camps? You'll hear him discuss that. These hunting camps in these early villages, could have been a precursor to the actual cities that we will discover when we get into the historic times around 3000 BC in the ancient Near East. Even writing, record keeping, and communication. Mr. Elliott mentions the cave art. That could be explored as not writing, of course, and not as we know it, but again, a precursor to the pictograms that we'll eventually see that turns into modern day writing throughout history. We go through the Sumerian, the cuneiform, we have the Egyptian, the hieroglyphics, the Phoenicians we get our modern day alphabet from them. That will be in another lecture talking about the Phoenicians, another group of people that lived in this region. And I found it extremely fascinating to find out how Mr. Elliott came up with his title for this lecture, From Alley-Oop to John Deere. And so you'll find out exactly who Alley-Oop is. Who is that? And you'll also discover why this will tie in to the Neolithic or the New Stone Age period, which is the topic of our discussion today. You've probably heard of the Neanderthal man. I mean, a lot of people have commercials, and you kind of have an image that Mr. Elliott will bring to life during his lecture of this Neanderthal man. He examines just who these people were. What did they look like? What did they eat? Again, we don't have written records at this time. So all of this is discovered through archaeology, through anthropology. Different things are discovered. Even cave art That helps. Every little thing helps. Where did they live? And most fascinating of all, at least in my opinion, is what happened to them. Mr. Elliott will explore that question in his lecture in a few minutes. He also discusses climate change, the growth in gathering plants to eat. In fact, we're starting to gather more than hunt, as we'll find out. You know, the herd of animals, some of them were dying out with this climate change. Some of them weren't adapting as well to the different environment. So people started gathering more than they were actually hunting. This allows them, as you'll find out, to actually settle in one region and still survive. They're not going to have to wander long distances in search of food. So this will be a consequence of starting with climate change. And there is a chain reaction, I guess you could say, that will be explored in this lecture. We also see a change from the Paleolithic age to the Neolithic age in relation to the changes in the kind of tools that were used, the kind of weapons that were used. Mr. Elliott actually states that, you know, man is very good at improving weapons and improving our use of them, you know, in order to, at first, survive and eat. Because these animals, as you learned in the first lecture, you know, lions and tigers and bears, oh my, were not exactly friendly, and so it was a race to survival for a lot of these prehistoric people. We'll also see with this lecture, prehistoric peoples were becoming less nomadic. They didn't wander around as much. And Mr. Elliott also mentions a very famous prehistoric Neolithic site. You may have heard of this. It's called Stonehenge. It's in England. And so we'll learn a little bit more about what was it for? What was the use of this? Very interesting stuff. And he also explores what exactly is the Neolithic Revolution. What is that? You'll find the answer to that question as well. What is hobby farming? What is the importance of grain? Now, the whole agriculture topic here. And what was the consequences of man's diet from changing from more of a meat, protein-based diet into that of grain? It's interesting how he relates that, how there's a change and a consequence of that change in diet. Very interesting what those consequences are. How did this affect women as well? Will also be part of this lecture. I can't wait to hear his lecture on alley-oop, from alley-oop to John Deere.
Last time in Lions and Tigers and Bears Oh My, reconsidering Western civilization and the Paleolithic era, we took our first steps in a semester-long migration across time and space, wandering around a bit in the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and started our explorations of the cultural and geographical influences and logical extensions of Western civilization. Today, from alley-oop to John Deere, reconsidering Western civilization in the Neolithic era, we'll ramble on in and out of Africa, following prehistoric man's cultural inclinations, learned in his wanderings after all those herds of grass-eating animals, and we'll go to and into and all about Western Europe, and then we'll go back again to the very ancient Middle East. Now, we were talking, reading, and thinking here about two very broad divisions of prehistory. The first, we're still in the Paleolithic, which runs from 600,000 to 10,000 BCE, before the current era, or before the Christian era, more or less the same thing as the old BC notation. And this is what's usually called the Old Stone Age. And then 2 will go into the Neolithic. Now, Neo means new, lithic means stone, so the New Stone Age. And the Neolithic runs from about 10,000 to 3,000 BCE. Now, in the first lecture, we danced our way around the controversial collisions between evolutionism and creationism, about whether it's grace in the finger of God or the mechanics of Charles Darwin's natural selection that directs our human origins and makes man man. And we've landed today right back in the briar patch of prehistory. Now, if recorded history makes up less than 1% of the time humans have lived on Earth, perhaps we should reconsider prehistory's long and influential 99+% a bit more carefully before we move on to consider the conventional and revisionist influences of our survey of civilization to 1500. Now, your text provides us with a pretty good toolkit that contains all the consensus hallmarks that might be thought to define Western civilization. They are agriculture and herding, cities, specialized labor and community authority, writing, and trade and cultural interactions. And from the lecture cycles, we might choose to add in some other influences as well. Pieces and parts traditionally drawn from the classical traditions of Greece and Rome, Christianity in its Western form, but we'll have to leave that third traditional influence, the Enlightenment, Europe's 16th and 17th century Age of Reason, to next semester's History 102. Now, in my first lecture, I introduced some additional elements for your consideration, these particular human inclinations evolving out of the old prehistory as possible influences on and extensions of Western civilization. Now, these are qualities that appear to be hardwired into humans generally and Western humans particularly, all from our prehistoric past. And these might help form, deform, and reform all those historical and cultural influences like agriculture, cities, authority, all the other aforementioned items. Now, the qualities I suggested that we consider are first tool making, which is the creative interaction of mind, eye, and hand to produce and refine usable functional objects. Second is the inclination and ability to develop effective weapon systems. And third is the ruthlessness to use them. Now, these three qualities, and I'm curious, do you think these are virtues and vices, all seem to surface hand in hand with prehistoric man in the Paleolithic and stay in our Western toolkit right up until, well, they're here with us right now. Now, in fact, you could argue that some of these hallmarks of Western civilization, as presented in your textbook, have already been tasted and tested by prehistoric hunting and gathering people. Essentially, what we find here in your text and in prehistory are slightly different versions of the same shopping list, which is traditionally thought to go into that toolkit that assembles Western civilization. And those things are agriculture and herding, but what's that? That's essentially food and food surplus. And now there's no farming in the prehistoric, but there are better weapons and a lot of game animals, so there's pretty much a prehistoric feast. Certainly you couldn't carry over much of a surplus of red meat because meat spoils and it attracts predators. So it's alike but not alike. The second was cities, and cities are simply matters of concentration, control, and commerce. And we know we have these small hunting camps, whether they are villages or rise up to the same level of cities in organization. That's another argument. Another thing we have is specialized labor and community authority, which is essentially religion and government. And we know for the hunters and gatherers, we had hunt leaders and followers. And we had a prehistoric faith. You see that in those Venuses and all those cave art. The other thing that we have as evidence of civilization is writing, which is essentially record-keeping communication. And you might want to think that cave art And petroglyphs, the drawing on rocks or rock art, might be a form of writing. Now, petroglyphs are also called pictograms, which are scratched on rocks to convey graphic symbols that represent a complex idea or thought. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, does cave art send particular and decipherable messages along with its sympathetic magic? Or pictograms, which are commonly found among all prehistoric peoples worldwide, especially in Western Europe, does appear to have some sort of a universal code then that we're only starting to decode now. And so there's a thought that we might really be looking at a form of prehistoric writing and we just don't know it, or we don't know how to figure it out yet. Well, it might not be such a great stretch to compare prehistoric rock-drawn petrographs and historical era cuneiform, since clearly pictograms are the grandfathers of cuneiform. What else do we have? We have trade and cultural interaction, and we have clear evidence in the prehistoric period of exchange of ideas, raw materials, and crafted objects. Now, what the prehistoric people experienced with these shared hallmarks are only variations on a much smaller scale, in a far simpler, much rougher, more primitive, less refined manner than did historic peoples. But 600,000 years of Paleolithic experiences has dramatically formed humans. It has helped some, at least, successfully evolve into full, true, and recognizable men and women, and has the power of deeply imprinting prehistoric values in the human psyche. Now, men and his values have spread all over the face of the planet, up from Africa, have crossed over the crossroads of the Middle East, and have made their way into Western Europe. Probably at first by following all those vast herds of migrating herbivores, those grass-eating mammoths, bison, wild cattle, deer, horses, and much more. And all the while confronting the fangs and claws and ruthless malice of the apex and alpha top of the food chain carnivorous meat and man-eating predators, the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, who with terrible beauty and a fearful symmetry will roar, rend, and devour men, women, and children according to will, whim, and appetite. Now, to these relatively puny human prehistoric hunters and gatherers, folks born without fangs or claws, not all that strong or swift, the ways of man-eating predators surely appeared as overwhelming, heart-stopping, life-ending moments of terror. Now, luck, fire, community, because there's always safety in numbers, certainly might give man some small chance and some edge in these lethal encounters with predators, but perhaps his survival depended more on the weapons in his hand and the courage in his heart. Prehistoric man could summon up out of his hunter's soul his warrior's face and a savage will to improvise, adapt, and overcome the roaring and the ripping. Now, in hunting, you are what you eat. But if being hunted, the idea is you don't want to be in what eats you. Now, the red meat world of the prehistoric has all that other white meat of humanity going untasted by lions and tigers and bears, oh my, only because man is armed and dangerous. All this eating and being eaten or not took place in the vast panorama of our prehistoric past and applies to Africa, Asia, the Americas, and to the Europe of our eventual Western civilization. Now, if we go with a progressive focus on the Middle East, classical Greece and Rome, the church and the rise of feudalism of the lecture cycle, then we have to start talking, thinking, and reading our way from the prehistoric to the historic. Now, there was a shared Paleolithic world existing progressively and simultaneously in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Americas, and most certainly in Europe. And those hard qualities of tool making, of killing to eat and live, of living by fighting and not being eaten by those lions and tigers and bears, oh my, were exported in all those migrations up to a Middle Eastern crossroads and carried up to and over all of Western Europe. Now, there's nothing particular may have driven or led man out of Africa or even kept him in there. If we look at Africa today, we see a vast array of these almost uncountable and almost unending menagerie of incredible animals. But if we think through the impact that prehistoric man had on natural and the animal world, we can see an undeniable pressure building. That's a particular sequence here. Man would develop and use tools and weapons. He would find the skill and courage to use them effectively. And he could hunt the prey more efficiently, and he could ward off predators with more elan. If he could do that, he could eat more and would not be eaten. He could live better and longer. And better and longer living men and women produce more children. And longer lived adults and more children grow the population, who can hunt better and can survive better and can pass on their improved hunting and gathering skills and cultural skills as well to more children. And what we have is a safe, if savage, cycle of more hunting, more security, more people moving about over more places. And what we get is more people and fewer animals. But there may be more of a big picture cause to this less animal part of the argument I'm making here than just the effect of better fed and better armed and ferocious men. When we try to imagine the vast migrations that takes place in the Paleolithic period, all these grass-eating herd animals moving across the planet, we probably all instantly and almost instinctively think back to the Serengeti of East and Central Africa. Now, while today's Serengeti might have all these mind-boggling menagerie of game animals, and with all the four-legged predators that like to eat them, and all the two-legged predators like to shoot them, we know that within our own lifetimes that the number of African animals has declined dramatically. They've declined under the force of hunting, over the greater intrusion of farming, over drought and a cornucopia of calamity. And we probably should have no speed bumps that the same thing didn't happen way back when. Man emerging from the savannas and jungles of Africa would have been most familiar with something like a Serengeti ecosystem. But we have to remember that climate as is does not always match up to climate as was. And approximately 10,000 years ago, the distinctive Paleolithic food of choice, the preferred provider of meat, hide, bone, and ivory, the tasty mammoth, disappeared worldwide. Now, much has been made in North America about this contemporaneous Pleistocene overkill that had better armed Clovis people, a name for a particular site in the Southwest, and a particular shaped flint point, the Clovis point. We need to kind of look at this. If you compare the Clovis point with a contemporaneous Danish point, you see that they are very, very different objects. One's smaller, one's larger, and there's a very subtle but pronounced different shape. Well, with this Clovis point, the argument goes that the Clovis people could more aggressively and more effectively hunt, and they overhunted in North America, and they drove the mammoth and other herbivores to extinction, at least in America. That would include the horse, which will disappear from North America and South America and won't reappear again until the Spanish arrive, and we're back at the end of History 101. Now, the world had been considerably colder back then, especially the further north you went. And so there's a possibility that as a climate change is going to come in as a big factor in this change of the animals and human resources. Now, we're not exactly sure, at least in the Americas, what's the chicken and which the egg, which is the heart of the cart. Is it the humans killing or the weather changing? But we know that animals simply disappear. Now, Paleolithic Homo sapiens wandering out of Africa through a cooler Middle East into a much colder Europe would have wandered into the good hunting territory already occupied by their rival cousins, the Neanderthals, who had made the trip up earlier. Now, Neanderthals were named for a particular river valley in Germany where the first fossilized relics of this very peculiar prehistoric men were found in 1856, have a particular image in our popular imagination. Now, earlier versions of the actual Neanderthals appear to be in the colder climates of Europe, Asia, and Western and Central Asia especially, since the beginnings of the Pleistocene. But they come to their maturity about 130,000 years ago, but they disappear about 50,000 years ago. And they currently exist only in Geico commercials as disgruntled TV watchers who eat roast duck with a mango salsa. Now, most of what our idea of cavemen are reflects what we think or used to think Neanderthals looked like or acted like. And they do seem to fit into this general idea of a prehistoric stereotype. They look a lot like the famous Alley Oop, who was a favorite newspaper comic character from the 1930s all up until I think maybe the 1970s. Now, Alley Oop is drawn as this heavy-browed, oddly built, fur-clad, club-armed, and wielding pre-man Neanderthal who knocks animals, enemies, and attractive women on the head. He's even rides dinosaurs, as you see misrepresented in the creationist theme parks. Now, there was a popular song in the 1950s, which I will not sing, which describes Alley Oop, 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 Oop as a Neanderthal. And the novelty song contributed greatly to our false image of cave and prehistoric men. As to the real Neanderthals, we used to think that a more advanced human cousins, the Homo sapiens, simply killed them off. Or maybe the advanced hunting skills and gathering skills of Homo sapiens pushed them out of the preferred prehistoric hunting grounds and they simply died off. Well, Neanderthals as Neanderthals do disappear, but we now know through DNA studies that they were absorbed and their genes deeply buried within our gene stream. Though other theories about climate change are often called up as the real culprit of their disappearance. Worldwide, as these various flavors of human beings are wandering hither, thither, and yon across the planet in pursuit of all manner of animals who are wandering hither and thither and yon for greener pastures, climate does change. Certain large animal species vanish and are only known now in the fossil record. A lot of mega herbivores, these great grass eaters, simply vanish, or others are simply downsized by nature. And after all this systemic climate change, human hunters turn from the massively disappearing massive herds of massive beasts to probably less massive herds of considerably smaller beasts. Now, some of the more terrible predators vanish as well, but still leaves lots of dangerous animals, all sorts of lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my! Well, if we try to imagine the Paleolithic geography in Europe to be more akin with the subarctic zone that currently stretches around Alaska, Canada, Upper Scandinavia, Siberia, and northern Mongolia, rather than today's African Serengeti. If we try to imagine those prehistoric Europeans more like the Sami, that's the new word for the old word lapsed, then as Maasai, and if we see the animals moving and being hunted more as reindeer than as wildebeest, you're probably closer to a functional idea of the animals and men in early prehistoric Western Europe for History 101. Now, these particular middle to late Paleolithic hunters and gatherers would still rely on the traditional and tried and true qualities of planning and organization, cooperation, acknowledgement that all can contribute, but some contribute more, a division of labor and the spoils, probably by meritocracy and gender, and a confidence in individual, group, and paranormal agencies. Now, we have to add in, though, maybe geography, climate, and climate change as some primary contributions to Western civilization in Western Europe. Now, in the upper geographic tier of the globe, where most of Northern Europe is, humans might actually benefit from a decline in certain large-scale game animals, such as the mammoth, if their extinction caused corresponding decreases in particular specialized predators that ate the mammoth and ate men. Now, as the weather would change, and climate got colder and warmer and warmer and colder, and prehistoric men moved farther north and west, lions and tigers, if not bears, oh my, would have dramatically decreased. The Middle East, Africa, and Asia kept dangerously large populations of lions and tigers all through prehistory, history, and even right up now to the present. But prehistoric man in Europe would have faced fewer kinds of alpha predators. It would probably only see bears, oh my, and wolves. Bears would be found in the very caves where man lived and where man put his art gallery, and wolves were in those deep European forests, hunting and eating the same deer as man did. But these northwestern European hunters, evolving with their tools, their weapons, and their ferocity into very highly efficient and effective hunters and warriors, rather quickly killed off all the bears and most of the wolves in Western Europe and started to make a dent in the endless herds as well. No mammoths and less deer, soon apex, alpha, and carnivorous meat-eating predators became only the fears in folk tales turned around the campfires, and not the fears of the clear and present danger stalking beyond the campfire light. And smaller presences of lions and tigers and bears helped Western civilization civilize. Now, climate change, though, might open us to a greater, new, and more diverse opportunity to look at smaller game animals who were provided with new and different natural vegetative resources. These new grasses directly and indirectly fed man and animals alike. Now, hunting still hosted the feast, but gathering, which were taken to new levels now of participation and providing. This was still very much a red meat world, but with new game and new game plants, we might suspect a new menu. Now, humans were never particularly carnivorous. I mean, even Jeffrey Dahmer ate his vegetables. And prehistoric men, women, and children were most assuredly always on the lookout for any gatherable or edible root and shoot, fruit, a nut, or berry. And with a new and man-friendly environment, and with the absence of the meal-for-a-month mastodons and any number of other large animal entrees who are now extinct, gathering increased in power, as did the hunting of smaller wild game, whose herds were probably reduced as well. As game herds changed and downsized, and man's hunting skills and weapons improved over time, humans in ever-growing numbers and organization began to cut back on rambling and roaming and began to occupy and claim, often exclusively as theirs, certain general and specific regions. Now, as extended kin groups began to move about over a more limited geography, they tended to trade more within their own kin connections and along the edges of an expanding circle of animal and human migrations and settlement. And meeting with more and different hunting bands, who all lived more or less on the same cultural level, introduced particular regional and personal refinements of traditional tools and weapons. And as dependent as they all were on a really good tool and weapon, Paleolithic hunters had a keen eye for a better device. And a healthy commerce would have surely been sparked and expanded. There are really good studies that show us that particular refinements of a particular form of axe head suddenly appears in one place and then begins to appear in more other places. Now, we can easily imagine what this must be about. We can imagine that Ugg trades Og some reindeer skins, and Og swaps Ugg a spiffy new axe. But we need to remember that the very idea of the axe as a form went around and comes around as well. And bones and stone tools are going to be refined by prehistoric people over time. That paleo deer bone dagger I brought in the other day works right nice. You can stab easily with this. It's a good tool. But a worked flint dagger, this is a dagger from Jutland. It would have had a shaft on it, a little bit longer. This is a joy to behold and to use. And it evidences a higher standard of what a good tool is, and also becomes a high-status weapon. I mean, this is good, but this is much better. And this probably evidences the rise of a higher material culture, and also the gratification of the cultural demands of an elite group. That old stone axe does an awfully fine job of hacking apart animal limbs to make good joints and good tasty morsels to eat. And you can smash your way, you can cut your way through those. But this old stone axe is fine, but what you got here is a Neolithic axe, which is considerably different. Now, this particular axe, which is from Denmark, is a beautiful thing. It's very elegant. It's very shapely. These are both the same objects, but they're not the same thing at all. This is designed to hack up meat, and this is designed to chop wood. Now, what this little Danish axe shows us is that there's a pervasive presence of these axes all through Europe, and that tells us that there's a change in the environment. With the changes in climate, there's a much stronger presence of forests all across Europe, and those forests have to be chopped down. Well, as the climate changed and more trees appeared, and as the herds decrease or remove themselves to safer, colder, or more species-appropriate territory, Paleolithic man in Europe becomes less a nomadic hunter and gatherer, and more the woodsman or woodswoman who will live in the forest that become to dominate so much of Western Europe. Now, hunters and gatherers, armed and dangerous from traditions, experiences, and legacies of 600,000 years as omnivorous hunters, begin to adjust to the new climate and geography. And they begin to perceive new opportunities and new challenges, new materials and methods, utilizing, developing, and exploring and exploiting as well a whole new world of evolving environments and cultures. Now, there is a marked change between the Old Stone and the New Stone Age, certainly, but 600,000 years deeply imprints particular ways and means of thinking and doing. And some of the cultural change we see are much more lateral moves than abrupt departures. The infinitely portable and individual objects, those prehistoric Venuses, and the relative small-scale communal localism of cave paintings, both the creatures and features of the Paleolithic beliefs, evolved and developed into much more public presences on a far greater scale in the Neolithic. Remember, the Neolithic is the New Stone Age and runs from 10,000 to 3,000 BCE. Well, at that time, standing stones and stone circles reveal a considerable larger reach of mind, eye, hand, and soul in this new megalithic culture. Mega, huge, lithic stone, huge stone, big stone culture, which is still visible all over most of northern Europe. Now, any number of these monumental artifacts of the prehistoric faith were constructed in the Mesolithic, the middle stone period, which is really the threshold between the Old and the New Stone Age. But most come into their own in the Neolithic era. And your text concentrates and comments on perhaps the most famous site of all, Stonehenge, on today's south-central England. It's a vast complex that began probably as early as 3000 BC, Your text gives you a pretty good picture of the inner ring of Stonehenge, but you can surely Google up more and better images and marvel at the great expanse, the enormous size, and the arresting setting of this great stone work. Now, why is it there? Well, we're not exactly sure, but reasonable consensus opinion at present settles on some astrological nature, some astronomical connection, something to do with the stars and their courses in the sky, combined with some monumental purposes and possibly with some funereal subtext. But what we really have here in this astronomical and astrological presence, this splendor of this great stone circle, hints at the most remarkable and revolutionary occurrence worldwide, and that's agriculture. Now, that means we have to change our focus and begin to perceive Western toolkits under all sorts of different hallmarks and influences. And really to see that particular change, the particular cultural engine of great revolution, agriculture, to see it as it first arrives, and to measure how much it will help spark all those other hallmarks of Western civilization, we have to leave Western Europe and return to the Middle East. Now, this is the most remarkable change that we're going to witness here, and it takes place after man has progressed from the Neolithic, from the prehistoric, Paleolithic into the Neolithic period, and after we have those significant changes in the old ways of hunting and gathering. This world-altering and civilization-sparking change is when and where prehistoric men went from hunting red meat into planting and harvesting grain. It's what we call the Neolithic Revolution, and we suspect it begins in the Middle East somewhere around 10,000 BCE. And from that centrality of location, we're spread east to Asia, west along the Mediterranean, and all the way up north and west into Europe. Now, so what the Neolithic represents is not just simply better and finer tools, but a very, very different and distinctive menu. And the Neolithic Revolution is all about wheat, and it's not about meat. Now, as prehistoric man moved further and further out of Africa and other countries and continents, and the climate changed, and the herds decreased and downsized, and man's population increased, late Paleolithic and early Neolithic hunters could no longer depend so exclusively and excessively on hunting alone. They came to focus more and more on hunting and gathering. And they begin to refine gathering into what we call hobby farming. Now, that's not like green acres or I'm going to go back to the land and set my soul free, some hippie back to the land movement. Hobby farming is more the observation of particular local and regional resources of wild plants, roots and shoots that could be seasonally and dependably available, that were then selectively and judiciously harvested, protected from other hunters and animals, and cultivated for further harvesting. And the Middle East turns to be the very center of the most natural and almost all the cultivated grains, grasses, and cereals. Now, what starts as hobby farming and gathering becomes agriculture, and we have the Neolithic Revolution. Now, farming starts to dominate hunting and gathering, and the rest, as they say, is history, and we really mean that. Prehistory starts to end with the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, which many think provides the basis of civilization. Men go from alley-oop to John Deere worldwide, and with an earth-shaking revolution. You are what you eat, and everybody starts to eat grain, and bread becomes the staff of life. Now, the John Deere of this lecture's title is not taken from the deer of those reindeer herders and hunters, but it's more of an allusion to the explosion of agriculture that perhaps flowers best, and maybe F-L-O-W-E-R-S or F-L-O-U-R-S, flowers best, excuse the pun, with the green John Deere tractor amid North America's amber waves of grain. our American Midwest breadbasket of the world is the logical extension of the agricultural roots of Western civilization. And Western civilization's agricultural roots are in the ancient Middle East. Now, in the Neolithic Revolution, wheat grows first and naturally right there in the Middle East, but grows better under careful care and cultivation. And man probably first noticed it because wild domestic animals kind of liked it. And if a deer or a goat could eat something, it's probably safe enough for humans too. But man would refine this wheat by cooking, probably first brewing beer, then making porridge, and then baking bread. Wheat is particularly high in protein, and it's not all that difficult to grow. It can be grown on a large scale, and large-scale harvests feed many hungry mouths. And not only does it grow well, but you can preserve the surplus. And this is especially true in what's a growing warmer and drier Middle Eastern climate where meat would certainly spoil. Now you can use a wheat to feed and fatten up wild and domestic livestock, and you can take the chaff and the straw and have opportunities for other uses. You can weave it, you can braid it. If you combine it with mud, you get bricks. And with bricks, you get houses, you get walls, you get citadels, you get cities, you get civilization. Now, all in all, wheat and barley and rye and all the other grains appear to make the Neolithic Revolution a win-win-win-win-win situation. But not everybody agrees with that. And some hold the Neolithic Era, ERA era, with its Neolithic Revolution to be the Neolithic Era, the ERROR, as in mistake. Some even consider the Neolithic Revolution the worst mistake in history of the human race. And they argue that for all its proposed and perceived benefits of agriculture over hunting, the man was and is, in fact, way worse off because of the Neolithic Revolution. And these folks will advocate what they call a return to a Paleolithic diet. Now, studies in surviving and historical hunters and gatherers seem to confirm their argument. It notes that hunters and gatherers work less than farmers, enjoy more leisure time, and consume larger doses of satisfying protein. Now, if we look at paleopathology, which is a study of old diseases, we see that it reveals a surprise that they are taller, thinner, and healthier prehistoric meat eaters when you compare them to grain-eating vegetarians, or I guess grainitarians. Now, the skeletal remains of humans in the Middle East on both sides of the Neolithic threshold show that Middle Eastern hunters and gatherers are about 5'9" for the men and 5'5" for the women. But after agriculture is brought in the very same area, the average height plunges to 5'3" for men and even 5 feet for women. You might want to note that hunter and gathering women are still taller than farming men. And you have to ask yourself, does size matter? Well, with the decline of meat eating and the rise of grains and vegetables come a marked increase in tooth decay and a marked decline in life expectancy. There's a 7-year average difference there, and it always favors the hunter-gatherers. Hunter and gatherers will certainly enjoy a wider and more diverse menu than farmers. And even though the game could run off or run at you, there appears fewer starving times and famines for hunting peoples than for farming peoples. Think about Ireland in the 1840s or before today. Well, concentration of people for farming brought more people in close by and kept them close in, and that complicated settlement, that complicated sanitation, and it caused the spread of all sorts of infectious diseases. And the evidence of civilization might be first the presence of diarrhea. Now, definitely though, agriculture dramatically increases the human population. And not just by offering more food, resources for more people, but by how it changes the pregnancy and the birth process. Women in nomadic hunter and gather cultures, being more mobile, have fewer pregnancies. A more active migratory lifestyle naturally limits your pregnancy. And we find out that sedentary farming women not only have more pregnancies, but they have more frequent pregnancies than hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gathering women have their children about every 4 years, and farming women have theirs every 2. Now, more and frequent pregnancies do produce more children, but also harms the health of the childbearing age women, who then produce less healthy children, so more is not necessarily better. A woman's status declines as much as women's health as you change from hunting and gathering to farming. Women cease to be co-equal gatherers to the men's hunting and become co-equal to the beasts of burdens of the farm. A woman and a donkey are about the same in farming societies. Women lose their status. But it's an overall status decline. Hunter and gatherers have sort of a egalitarianism where everybody is more or less equal. That's going to be replaced in farming societies by authority and direction and order. Someone has to figure out how, when, and where we plant the crops, how, when, and where we store the crops, and who gets how much of what we grew. Sort of like the little red hen, who will help me do these acts? And the flip side of that is that we have the rise of elites who will tell you what to do. We give them authority, they give us direction and orders, and they give us tyranny back. So, liberating or not, the Neolithic Revolution seems to be a revolution of more quantity over better quality. Now, certainly farming could feed more people than hunting did, though the quality of that feeding declined, as did people's health and happiness. If you work more, you have less leisure time, you had bad health, and you have tyrants, you're probably not too happy. So, why did they do this? Why did they go from being hunters and gatherers to all these farmers and give us this rise of civilization? Well, it might be simply a matter of luck and pluck, or maybe it's just circumstance. If the climate changes and the types and size of migrating herd animals decreases, if man's tools and weapons get better, and man can hunt the grass eaters more efficiently and stave off the man eaters more effectively, the population will increase. If the population increases, with the resources on the hoof decreasing, prehistoric man did what he always did. He tried to increase food supply. That meant he turned to a more intensive gathering, and that became a hobby farming, which was carried along and up from the Paleolithic. It evolved into farming, and we get the Neolithic Revolution. And farming does produce more, if not better, food. History starts officially with the Neolithic Revolution, with agriculture, with grain, with wheat and barley, which takes control of animal herding and domestication of livestock, makes those wild animals tame. Farming will cause villages and cities to be built, and because it needs a concentration of settled farmers. It divides into specialized labor and community authority. It gives us all those priests and kings. It invents and refines writing so we know how many grains and how many sacks of grain we have. It opens up to and for trade and cultural interaction. We trade grain for this or that, and we have more material possessions because we are more locked in place on the land farming. We're more settled. If you're settled, you can have more. People moving about all the time always carry less. Now, all those qualities that seem to make farming work also makes Western civilization work as well. And we go from alley-oop to John Deere, and we really haven't looked back. Now, whatever this is good, bad, or indifferent, Western civilization, traditionally based on heritage arising from the Neolithic Revolution's agriculture in the Middle East, and certainly with its own indigenous traditions and values, which you'll hear, read, and think about over the rest of the semester from the lecture cycle, has deep roots in the prehistoric, where men and women by necessity improvised, adapted, and overcame a most demanding natural environment by the tools they made and the weapons they wielded. And over your course of your wandering through History 101, when you consider all the cultural amenities of Western civilization, brought in from the Middle East, brought in from exchange with other cultures, rising organically from the European soil and culture, you might want to consider including that deeper and abiding legacy from our Paleolithic past, our prehistoric past, an armed and dangerous ferocity, with or without the mango salsa. Thank you so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed Mr. Elliott's lecture, From Alley Oop to John Deere. Just love the title. Absolutely enjoyed the lecture. Who knew that a topic of prehistoric Neolithic people could be so interesting? It was absolutely excellent. Our next lecture in this series will be presented by Dr. Bill Robison. He is the department chair of the Department of History and Political Science here at Southeastern Louisiana University. And he will cover the beginning of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, specifically with the Sumerians, the invention of writing, cuneiform. He will also tell us about other people living in ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, if you go look on a map today, such as the Akkadians and numerous others. I find this period in history very captivating, and I hope you will too. Until next time.